Welcome to The Debate. Today we are exploring the foundational identity of, well, arguably the most uncompromising, globally dominant rock band in history, AC/DC.
Right, a total juggernaut of a band.
Absolutely. And, when you look at the construction of a brutalist skyscraper, you naturally marvel at the raw materials. You see the deep concrete foundation, the heavy steel girders, the absolute precision of the architectural blueprint. Every rivet is placed to withstand tremendous pressure. The architect knows exactly what the building is meant to do from the very moment the first line is drawn on the paper.
Sure, it's a marvel of heavy engineering. But a building is just a hollow, sterile shell until it is actually occupied.
Right.
It's the life inside, the chaotic, unpredictable, sometimes destructive human element that transforms a cold steel structure into a living, breathing entity with an actual soul.
Merely the result of the calculated, clan-like strategic vision and fierce discipline of the Young family. They were the architects who engineered the machine.
And I am arguing that without the visceral, dangerous, frankly chaotic life experiences of their frontman, Bon Scott, the Youngs' calculated vision would have remained a derivative, fabricated gimmick. Bon Scott was the life inside the building that actually made it real.
Well, to understand the foundation of this band, you really have to understand the blueprint, which was meticulously designed by the Young brothers, Malcolm, Angus, and their older brother George. Everything traces back to their roots in the Cranhill schemes, which were, these brutally tough, working-class public housing projects in Glasgow.
Very bleak environments.
Incredibly bleak, and growing up in that environment forged this impenetrable us-against-them clan mentality. But the real strategic vision for the band came from a place of deep professional trauma.
Ah, you're talking about George Young's time in the Easy Beats?
Exactly. George had achieved massive international success in the 1960s with the hit Friday on My Mind, but he learned the hard way how the music industry operates. He watched his band get compromised, they chased pop trends, they were pushed by executives into recording these schmaltzy orchestral ballads.
Trying to be all things to all people.
Right. And trying to please everyone ultimately destroyed the group. He brought that bitter lesson back to his younger brothers. He explicitly taught Malcolm and Angus that compromising your core sound is a death sentence. So when Malcolm formed AC/DC, he ruthlessly controlled its direction. He ran it like a military unit.
He certainly did.
If a member didn't fit the clan's exact vision, Malcolm fired them without hesitation. Their identity as a no-bullshit rock band wasn't a happy accident. It was a deliberate, top-down construct.
I understand why you focus on George's warnings, but if we actually pull back the curtain on the band's early days, that supposed strategic vision was deeply flawed. I'd argue it was highly derivative and, frankly, artificial until Bon Scott arrived. You speak of this pure, uncompromising rock blueprint, but under Malcolm's early leadership with their first singer, Dave Evans, the band was desperately chasing the glam rock trends of the era.
Look, they were just finding their footing.
Finding their footing by wearing satin? They were trying to mimic bands like Slade or Skyhooks. Malcolm himself, your brutalist architect, was wearing a yellow and black silk top and a tam o' shanter, like a traditional Scottish bonnet on stage.
It was the style at the time.
And their bassist was wearing silver foil bell-bottoms. It was a contrived cabaret act. Bon Scott completely changed that trajectory. Here was a man who didn't need a costume. He had survived Riverbank, which was a maximum security boys' home. He'd lived through a near-fatal motorcycle crash that smashed his jaw and endured years of heartbreaking music industry failure.
He definitely had a rough go of it.
Absolutely. Bon injected the necessary authentic danger. He brought that classic Australian larrikin energy, the lovable but genuinely rebellious scoundrel. He transformed them from a cartoonish pop act into a visceral rock entity.
I think a lot of people listening might assume the early glam phase defines their lack of direction, but let me give you a different perspective on that musical foundation. Visually, yes, they experimented, but musically, the blueprint for their sound was firmly in place before Bon ever stepped up to the microphone.
I'm not so sure about that.
Well, Malcolm Young was incredibly studious about music. In his earlier bands, he was playing complex jazz rock fusions. He understood the intricate musicality of Stevie Wonder and Santana. But when he formed AC/DC, he made a very calculated choice to abandon that complexity.
Right, because complex jazz fusion wasn't going to sell in a sweaty Australian pub.
Partly yes, but also because he recognized the power of rhythm. He deliberately steered the band away from the pretentious, arty-farty progressive rock of the 1970s. He studied bands like Cactus and Mountain, focusing entirely on driving rhythmic boogie. Stripping music down to 3 chords is actually incredibly difficult to do well.
Oh, sure, there's nowhere to hide. Exactly. There is nowhere to hide. The groove has to be perfect. Like those brutalist architects, Malcolm stripped away all the decorative nonsense to build a structure purely out of rhythm. He even made the calculated decision to step back into the shadows to play rhythm guitar, pushing Angus to the front to be the focal point. They knew exactly what they wanted musically. You bring up Malcolm's musical pedigree and his brilliant rhythmic choices, but I keep coming back to the visual reality. If they were such master architects with a concrete vision, why did their early promotional film for the song Can I Sit Next to You Girl feature such ridiculous posturing? Marketing? You have Dave Evans thrusting his microphone stand, wearing calf-high, stack-heeled boots and a chest-bearing blouson. If their vision was so pure and uncompromising, why bow to the pressure to look like an English glam band?
Because they were teenagers figuring out the visual marketing of a product.
But that's exactly my point. They were chasing the tail of a trend. They were playing opening slots for Lou Reed and trying to figure out what would sell to a pop audience. Their vision wasn't concrete and steel yet. It was sequins and foil. They didn't know who they were.
I'd argue the glam phase was an incredibly brief, calculated experiment that they abandoned precisely because of their clan-like discipline. They were highly adaptable. When Malcolm realized the satin jumpsuits weren't working, he pivoted ruthlessly. And out of that brief experimentation came the true stroke of branding genius, Angus's schoolboy uniform.
Which started as a joke.
But it became an icon. That wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move suggested by their sister, Margaret, and Malcolm and George instantly recognized its commercial power. But here is the psychological mechanism of why it worked. Malcolm ordered the rest of the band back into plain jeans and t-shirts, specifically to contrast with Angus.
Setting him apart.
Exactly. If everyone is dressed crazy, the band is just a circus. But if only Angus is in a school uniform, set against a backdrop of rough, street-looking thugs playing heavy boogie, he creates a brilliant subversive anchor. That's not a band that is lost. That is agile, brilliant brand engineering.
Okay, the school uniform worked, absolutely. But it was dangerously close to becoming a novelty act. Before they truly found their footing, Angus was doing mock sword fights on stage with Dave Evans using a plastic rapier. He experimented with a Zorro costume, a Superman outfit, even a gorilla suit. I mean, it was borderline pantomime.
Again, trial and error.
But the error was the dominant feature until Bon arrived. The schoolboy outfit only stopped being a gimmick when it was juxtaposed against the very real, street-level menace that Bon Scott brought to the stage. Without Bon standing next to him, Angus in a schoolboy outfit is a comedy act.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Oh, I would. With Bon, a guy who looks like he might actually stab you if you cross him, the schoolboy becomes a menacing, twisted contrast.
But see, street-level menace and chaos alone will destroy a band just as quickly as chasing pop trends. If we trace Bon back to his days before AC/DC, he was in a band called Fraternity. They were this rambling, drug-soaked hippie collective, dropping acid, living on a communal farm, and releasing esoteric progressive rock that went absolutely nowhere. Bon had all that authentic chaos in Fraternity, and it resulted in total commercial failure.
Well, he was a product of his environment there, just like he was in AC/DC.
Exactly, which proves my point. It was only the Youngs' strict, ruthless governance that harnessed Bon's chaotic energy into a viable career. Let's look at the mechanics of their work ethic. During their residency at Chuckers, which was a grueling, notoriously tough nightclub in Sydney, Malcolm had them playing 4 or 5 blistering sets a night. It was industrial labor.
It was brutal.
Right. And when their drummer, Colin Burgess, passed out on stage because his drink was allegedly spiked, Malcolm didn't care about excuses. He fired him immediately. When bassist Larry Van Crete wasn't locking into the groove perfectly, he was out. AC/DC survived and thrived because Malcolm provided a disciplined, ironclad framework that Bon Scott desperately needed but could never construct for himself.
Discipline without soul is just sterile execution, though. I will give you the work ethic. The Youngs were relentless, but chaos was the secret ingredient that made people actually care about the music. Bon didn't just bring an image, he brought a lived reality that Malcolm and Angus, who were practically still kids, had never actually experienced.
Oh, come on. They experienced plenty of hardship in Glasgow.
True, but Bon lived the rock and roll underworld. He didn't just pretend to be a bad boy for the press. He had spent his days shoveling literal shit at the Wallaroo fertilizer plant just to make ends meet. He had shared bottles of bourbon with Jerry Lee Lewis. He walked onto the stage barefoot with missing teeth in worn-out dungarees. He wasn't playing a character.
Fair enough.
Even Malcolm himself later admitted that Bon was the biggest single influence on the band, because Bon had that authentic, stick-it-to-'em attitude. Bon was the one who taught them how to actually embody the tough guys they were trying to project.
I don't disagree that Bon's life was genuinely hardscrabble. His authenticity is not in question. But I challenge the idea that his chaos was the primary shaping force of the band's ethos, because even Bon's wildness was ultimately curated, contained, and monetized by the Youngs. The real proof of this dynamic is in the recording studio.
Ah, you're going back to George.
Always back to George. George Young and his production partner Harry Vanda were the ultimate safety net. They didn't just record the band, they structured the songs. They provided the commercial pop news that George had perfected in the 60s. They ensured the band didn't, in George's own words, disappear up their own arse into endless jamming. The Youngs provided the impenetrable canvas and the rigid boundaries.
I know a lot of people like to say Bon was just the paint the Youngs used to color their blueprint, but I think that wildly underestimates his creative authorship.
How so? The riffs dictated the songs.
The riffs provided the rhythm, but Bon provided the voice, the lyrics, and the human soul. Let's talk about the creation of his first song with the band, She's Got Balls. He wrote that about his estranged wife, Irene. He poured his actual broken marriage, his raw life, and his cheeky, defiant humor directly into the music.
It is a great track.
Right? Dave Evans was a pop star posing with his shirt off, making up generic rock lyrics about partying. Bon was a 28-year-old hardened veteran fighting for his last chance at survival.
He was definitely writing from a place of desperation.
Absolutely. He carried a school exercise book everywhere. He was constantly writing down lyrics, drawing from his pain, his poverty, and his experiences. You like analogies? The Youngs might have built a massive, heavy V8 engine with their rhythm section. But an engine like that doesn't run on standard fuel. It needs something highly volatile to actually roar. Bon wasn't just the paint on the car. He was the nitro injected straight into the cylinder. Without that volatile fuel, the engine would have just hummed along anonymously.
I mean, that is a highly romanticized view of his contribution. Yes, he wrote brilliant, evocative lyrics, but you cannot ignore the deep Crenhell grit that Malcolm and Angus already possessed. You talk about Bon's toughness as if the Youngs were suburban kids who needed a tough guy to show them the ropes. The Young brothers grew up in one of the bleakest, most violent environments in Scotland. Their father was out of work. That sheer bloody-mindedness never left them. Malcolm and Angus were famously fearless brawlers. They never lost a fight, despite being incredibly short in stature.
They were tough kids, absolutely.
They carried that working-class, us-against-the-world mentality to Australia, where they lived in a tin hut at the Villa Wood Migrant Hostel. They vividly remembered black worms swimming in the floodwaters outside their door. Their authenticity was forged in iron long before Bon Scott walked into the picture. They didn't need Bon to teach them how to be tough. They needed him to act as the charismatic megaphone for the toughness they already possessed.
Being tough in a schoolyard fight is very different from projecting authentic rock and roll danger to an audience of thousands. That requires a totally different kind of psychology. Let's look at how Bon actually changed their interpersonal dynamic. Before Bon, Malcolm was incredibly insecure and jealous of Dave Evans. If Dave talked to female fans, Malcolm would literally pull Dave's hair out of jealousy. trying to start a fistfight. The band was fractured by ego and immaturity.
Well, they were young, finding their dynamic.
Right, and when Bon came in, he was a decade older. He became known as Bon the Likeable. He managed the brothers' egos, he introduced Angus to new records. He took Angus, this gawky teenager in a school uniform, and physically showed him what it meant to hold a sweaty pub crowd in the palm of your hand. Bon wasn't just a focal point, he was the mentor who taught the youngs how to translate their Glasgow street fighting into rock and roll swagger.
Look, I think you're confusing Bon's sociability with leadership. Bon may have been Bon the Likeable, but make no mistake, Malcolm was the one making the decisions. Let's look at their very first interaction. When Bon showed up for his first gig, Malcolm took one look at him and immediately commanded him to cut his waist-length hair and lose the hippie overalls.
And he did.
Exactly. He complied. Why? Because Bon knew instantly that Malcolm was the absolute boss. Think about Bon's mindset at that moment. He had just spent months recovering from a horrific motorcycle crash that left him in a coma for 3 days. He was 28, his marriage was failing, and he had absolutely zero career prospects. He desperately needed the structure that the Youngs provided. Dave Evans refused to cut his hair when Malcolm asked. Bon did it because he recognized the superiority of the Youngs' strategic vision. Bon recognized that George and Malcolm had built a vehicle that could actually take him to the top.
He complied with the haircut, yes, but trace that forward to the stage, he completely hijacked the presence of the band. You say Malcolm was in complete control, but at Bon's very first gig with them at the Rockdale Masonic Hall, Bon had downed 2 bottles of bourbon, smoked a 1/4 ounce of weed, and walked out barefoot.
A massive risk that could have backfired.
But it didn't. He grabbed the microphone and announced to the crowd, anyone that's come to see Dave Evans sing ain't gonna see it tonight. The band fired him because he got married. Malcolm was standing in the wings, absolutely terrified, gasping, "What has this guy done?" That is not Malcolm controlling the narrative. That is Bon Scott seizing the reins and forcing the band to step up to his level of absolute unpredictability. Angus said his feet literally lifted off the ground when Bon started singing. The rigid, concrete structure the Youngs built was suddenly electrified by a force they couldn't control, and that lack of control is exactly what made it brilliant.
It was an incredible moment, certainly, but let's not pretend it wasn't immediately folded into the Youngs' master plan. George Young was watching that dynamic unfold, and as the ultimate producer, he knew exactly how to capture it. George and Harry Vando were the ones who took that raw, barefoot energy and physically compressed it into tightly structured, commercially viable 3-minute rock songs. You can have all the bourbon-soaked energy in the world, but if you don't have George Young behind the mixing desk telling you to cut the fat, you end up with indulgent, meandering progressive rock.
I don't know if I agree with that.
It's true. The Youngs' genius was their ability to commodify Bon's chaos. They put a frame around the storm.
But without the storm, it's just an empty frame. Look at what George and Harry were producing before Bon arrived. They were throwing pop darts at a wall. They tried to turn a singer named William Shakespeare into a glam rock idol. They were writing soft pop ballads for John Paul Young. Brilliant producers, yes, but they were searching for a real subject. Bon gave them the definitive, undeniable truth to record.
They gave him the platform to say it.
But he gave them the words. Bon's lyrics weren't just clever. They were a documentary of his actual life. He was writing about crippling poverty, about drinking to survive, about venereal disease, about the actual dirt under his fingernails. He rescued the Youngs from becoming just another sophisticated pop production team. He gave them a subject matter that was so gritty and real that they had no choice but to build their heaviest, most uncompromising riffs around it to match his intensity.
Well, as we wrap up this discussion, I think the mechanics of the band's foundation are clear from my perspective. The AC/DC machine was built, tuned, and fiercely protected by the Young clan's unyielding vision and relentless work ethic. George, Malcolm, and Angus survived the brutal realities of both the Glasgow schemes and the unforgiving music industry by forming an impenetrable wall around themselves. They calculated their sound, ruthlessly curated their lineup, and designed a brilliant branding strategy. Bon Scott was undoubtedly the perfect explosive frontman, but he was ultimately the final, necessary piece slotted into a machine that Malcolm and George Young had already willed into existence through sheer discipline.
And to summarize my perspective, that machine was effectively a cabaret act playing to backing tracks of whatever was trendy until Bon Scott arrived. They were wearing silk tops and silver bell-bottoms, playing to the glam rock crowd, and searching desperately for an identity. It was Bon Scott, with his prison record, his smashed teeth, his poetry scribbled in a school exercise book, and his genuine heartbreak, who injected the nitro fuel into their engine. He transformed them from a derivative, calculating pub band into a genuine rock and roll force of nature.
But perhaps there is a profound point of convergence we can both agree on. The unique magic of AC/DC ultimately required both of these elements in equal measure. It needed the impenetrable, disciplined, concrete vessel constructed by the Youngs, and it desperately needed the volatile, authentic, chaotic fuel of Bon Scott. Neither could have conquered the globe without the other.
I completely agree. It's the intersection of that cold calculation and that bleeding authenticity that makes rock history so fascinating to examine. The source material offers so many more incredible details about the band's relentless rise, showing just how fragile that alchemy really was in those early days.
Exactly. So, we return to our skyscraper. You could admire the cold perfection of the steel girders, or you can marvel at the wild storm raging through its halls. We'll leave it to you to decide which element was the true catalyst for the band's legendary identity.